Holy ground? Or a stage for something that shouldn't exist there at all? The Devil in the Cathedral. It sounds like a headline, but the people who sent these stories insisted it began in a place as ordinary and worn as any parish. Stone benches polished by generations, candles whose smoke smells like old prayers, a bell that still tolls for noon. They told me the thing that walked into that cathedral did not rattle chains or roar. It used words meant for confession, and it laughed in the language of the altar. My name is Marcos. I host a small late-night show where people send in what they remember from the dark. For years I translated those submissions, because the original voices came from across Mexico, Querétaro, San Miguel de Allende, a town whose name people still whisper like a charm. Tonight they come to you in English with care. These are not studio-made scares. They are memories carried home on buses and whispered between neighbors, small reports folded into pockets and passed along until a priest, a sacristan, a young couple, and a handful of children were left to hold what they could no longer explain. The first story is the reason the title sticks in people's throats. It was sent by someone who knows the cathedral not as a tourist, but as a place of work and habit. They asked to stay anonymous. What follows is what they reported in their voice, with my questions, and with the small connective thread I can offer as someone who has heard 100 versions of the same fear. The cathedral sat on a wide plaza, the facade warmed by afternoon light that made its carved saints look tired but familiar. The old priest, almost 80 they said, had been relieved of some duties because of his age. Still, every Wednesday he returned to the confessional for a short shift. For him it was habit, prayer, penance. On a slow weekday, the sacristan had gone to fetch a missal. The church was empty except for those two and the dust motes in the beam of a stained glass window. He asked for confession, the sender wrote. He always did. He wanted to say Mass for an old friend. There was nothing special that day, except the way the air felt like a held breath. The priest took his usual seat behind the lattice. The voice that answered him was not a tremor or a child's falter. It was a clear, deliberate voice, the witness said, and what made it worse was that it used the same cadence the priest used at the altar. It called out phrases the priest expected to hear from penitents, the little prompts that make the penitential rite move forward. And then it did something that no human penitent could. It began to mock those sacred phrases. The laughter that followed wasn't loud. It was a dry, thin sound as if someone had scraped a fingernail across vellum. He said the words back to him. The sacristan told me later in a brief recording the sender included, but with a grin inside each syllable. It was like someone learning prayers to make fun of them. When the priest pushed the small lattice aside and looked through the confessional window, there was nobody sitting there. He described later to those who would listen, a cold that moved as if it had shape. The sacristan, who had been sweeping, thought he saw a silhouette moving along the nave. It was the sort of shadow that didn't quite belong to any of the pillars, smooth, tall, and oddly disproportionate against the flicker of candlelight. He followed it, because that's what sacristans do when something in the church is out of place. They investigate. Underground corridors run beneath many old cathedrals, a maze of storage rooms and forgotten altars. The sacristan said he heard his own breath echoing back at him. He said the shadow did something else. It leaned against a wall and stretched as if to listen. Then when he caught up, he reported seeing something the words horns don't quite fit. He described two small protuberances on the silhouette's forehead, more like knobs than goat's horns, but they read to him as horns. He used a word the priest later used too. Impudence. Not a theological diagnosis, but a feeling of being mocked in the place where people go to confess what weighs on them. After that, measures were taken. The cathedral staff requested a blessing. The old priest, who had been woken by the confessional shadows, performed what he could. Neighbors wrote candles into the margin of their own nights. People kept their children close. But no one pretended the fear had vanished. The sacristan said that for days, sometimes at dawn, he would see a patch of darkness sitting on the cathedral roof like a person waiting for a bus. It would melt into the tiles when anyone looked directly at it. That was only the beginning. Some priests in the city told the staff that most contact thought to be spirits is actually malevolent in intent. Others said that fear has a way of feeding itself. The old priest, in a tone the sender described as both weary and urgent, told his colleagues that such mockery in a confessional was not something to be taken lightly. He offered caution rather than a creed. He said in a voice that still carried the tremor of an old man who felt responsibility for the souls in his charge, "Take care for the people who come here to confess. Some things come to play in a place of prayer. If that made your skin crawl, wait until you hear the next one." I need to pause here with a small, careful warning. The next submission contains a personal loss. If you are pregnant, or close to someone who is, please know this is told as a testimony of grief, not as a causal claim. The woman who sent it asked for compassion in the way she described days that, to her, seemed threaded together by stories she had heard and a dream she could not shake. She made it clear she does not know what happened. She only knows how it felt. I'll read it slowly because it needs room. She had been listening to the late-night program for comfort, my sender said, a ritual that made the shadows less sharp. One evening she tuned into a story that began with a warning, the kind people sometimes offer jokingly, but which in this case felt like a literal sign. Don't listen if you're expecting. She remembered the line as a joke she ignored. Days later, fatigue and nausea gave way to an ordinary doctor's appointment. A week after that, when she should have been feeling a new kind of joy, the doctor told her the baby had no heartbeat. The way the world rearranged itself after that appointment is what filled her letter. She moved through rooms like a lost person in a map that no longer corresponded. Nights were worst. The radio became a machine that fed her fear rather than soothed it. The story she had ignored returned to her in pieces. She described a dream in which a shadow visited her and spoke in a voice that sounded like the voice in her headphones. In the dream, the shadow did not ask or beg, it insisted. In the dream, it demanded the child. She woke drenched in sweat and told her partner, who later told her he too had a dream. A simple dream, he said, where a closing door made a small, hollow sound, and he felt the presence of being watched from the opposite room. They interpreted those dreams as people do with strange coincidences, not as explanation, but as a way to hold together what felt like two separate tragedies. The woman wrote that the timing of the radio story, the dream, and the doctor's news compressed around her like a ring. She did not write the story caused this in any of her lines. She wrote, it felt connected. That feeling is the important thing to carry with us when we talk about this kind of experience. People try to give shape to loss with the only tools they have. Sometimes that means tying an external narrative to an internal wound. When she reached out to friends, what came back were two kinds of responses: comfort that tended to the human pain, and a handful of neighbors who offered rituals and blessings the way others offered casseroles. The couple accepted the embraces and the prayers. They refused sensationalism. They wanted their grief held, not explained away. If you're listening and this has stirred something in you, if you have words of support or a similar experience you think could help, please consider sending it to our community group. People in that space often share quietly, not to prove anything, but to say they were heard. Be gentle. That message, one soft public invitation to hold people with care, is the only call I make here. The rest of this episode keeps its focus on what people remembered and how those memories changed the way they moved through the dark. After grief, communities do what they always do. They tell stories to keep watch. That's how the duendes tale came to us. Duendes, for the listeners who don't know, can mean many things. Household sprites in one telling, mischievous forest folk in another. In the neighborhood the sender remembered, the house of the duendes was a small, faded cottage behind a reja, an iron gate, where children dared each other to lean close and listen for tiny footsteps. 3 children, the sender said, Sophia, Juan, and another boy whose name she couldn't recall but whose fear she could still name, spent an afternoon daring each other into play. Heat lay over the narrow street like a blanket. The watchfulness of adults was elsewhere, washing clothes, preparing dinner, voices raised in the kind of ordinary distractions neighborhoods survive on. The children crept to the reja to press their faces to the iron and call out for duendes, their challenge sounding small and brave. What they found was not small. From behind the gate, a figure moved, The witness, now grown, still writes with the astonishment of a person who once believed they had seen something only children could see. It wasn't just dark, she told me. It was like someone had poured blackness into the shape of a person and stood it up near the wall. The children ran. They ran with the kind of scream that splits a child's body into a dozen sounds. Crying, teeth-clenched sobs, breath like cargo that could be dumped. Neighbors came out. People shone flashlights and scolded children, and looked for rational explanations. A man in a dark jacket, a crude costume, the play of light off plastic. They found small, muddy footprints leading away from the gate and stopping at the curb, as if someone had wiped their hands and left. The footprints were the wrong size for any child and too narrow for a man's shoe. For a while, the street agreed to be afraid. Parents kept their children indoors at dusk. Mothers crossed themselves when a shadow passed their doorway. A priest came and blessed the little stretch of road. The blessing, as the sender explained, didn't banish memory. It allowed people to sleep again. For a time the laughter of children returned to the street, though the old mothers still told the story in low voices as if it were a prayer or a warning. When I asked the sender how the neighborhood survived the collision of childhood games and something more ambiguous, she said this: "We learned that some doors don't close the same after you've tried to open them. You can sweep, you can bless, you can hold your children, but the memory will be there like a scar you don't show." That line, the idea of a scar you don't show, became one of those small hooks that kept the stories threaded together in my head. Scar, shadow, the sound of breath where breath ought not to be. The motifs repeated, a voice mimicking sacred phrases, horns that read like mockery, a tall black figure seen by children, a light that never goes out. The last tale for tonight is quieter, and for that reason it clings differently. It comes from someone who moved into a narrow apartment building not far from the cathedral. At first, the detail is mundane, an upstairs neighbor who never seemed to be home. Doors opened and closed sometimes, packages would appear in the hallway. But the light in that unit stayed on, always, no matter the hour. The sender noticed it one night returning from work, a square of yellow through a tiny window that looked like a permanent eye. For a while it was just curiosity. People have different schedules. Maybe the tenant worked nights. But then other small things began to poke holes in the ordinary explanation. The sender wrote about hearing breathing that didn't fit any person passing by in the hall. Too regular, too close to the door to be someone outside. Cameras the apartment manager had installed at the staircase sometimes malfunctioned when they were pointed toward that door. Once, the camera's feed showed the lobby empty, and the light in the upstairs window frozen as if in a photograph, while the hallway camera recorded the soft sound of something pacing. At night I would pass and feel like someone was at the door watching me, the sender wrote. The feeling followed me like a shadow whispers behind for days after I moved. They tried knocking once, a half-joking, neighborly tap that people do when they want to say hello. No one answered. A small envelope later appeared under the door with no name and nothing inside but dust. The sender's sleep grew peppered with the same friction they had begun to notice in the cathedral. A tightness across the chest. A sensation of being observed. The final act, the sender reported, was moving out. Not an act of heroism, a small practical choice. New lease, new building, new routine. The last image they left me with was of the light continuing to burn in that window even after they had gone. I could tell you what any of this means. I could frame it in tidy categories: psychological projection, sleep disturbance, grief. But my role here is translation and testimony, and to leave judgments in the hands of those trained to make them. Instead, I want to offer something else. A few threads to hold these stories together without pretending to knot them into a conclusion. First, sanctuaries do not always feel like sanctuaries to those who experience violation there. The priest and sacristan who reported the mockery in the confessional described a wound to a place meant for healing. Their shock came from a breach of trust more than from spectacle. Second, grief and fear look for narratives that make them bearable. People often apply meanings to events not because they are certain, but because meaning is a way to carry pain. Third, the language of childhood and folklore, duendes, tall black things at the gate, shows how communities use story to protect and warn their young. Stories are part of the safety net even as they sometimes fray it. Across these testimonies are recurring motifs that I cannot ignore. A voice that breathes like a mockery inside a sacred ritual, a shadow that stands taller than a fence, small protuberances on a silhouette's forehead that read to witnesses as horns, and a light that refuses to shut off. They are not claims of theology. They are patterns of human experience. I don't want to leave you with a catalog of fear. These stories are also full of ordinary courage. A sacristan who checked a corridor when no one else would, neighbors who came out to chase children home, a priest who performed blessings and then went back to his duties with a heavier step, a couple who asked for prayers and comfort rather than headlines. People met the uncanny with care, and there is grace in that. It may be tempting at the end of a night of such tales to issue a warning like a label on a packet. Don't. Instead, carry a quieter admonition. Be awake to each other's needs. If someone says they were mocked in the confessional, don't dismiss them as superstitious. Listen. If someone loses a child and traces a shadow across the days that followed, don't pry for causes. Offer presence. If a kid is terrified of a gate, don't laugh. Check the gate and take the fear seriously. Before I sign off, one final note about the title that brought you here. The Devil in the Cathedral is an image people use to give shape to the central story, because the mockery felt so intimate and so wrong inside a place meant for confession. The word devil carries weight. It carries centuries. In these accounts it appears mainly as a way for witnesses to name outrage and profanation more than a formal theological label. The priest used that language at one point, but he did it as a warning and as a way to insist people be cautious for their flock. Keep that distinction in mind. Language is a tool people use to share what they feared. It is not proof. If any of tonight's stories touched you, whether with fear, recognition, or the need to say me too, there is a place where people gather the way neighbors gather on stoops. A quiet online community where we collect anonymous submissions, hold grief, and exchange small consolations. If you want to send a message of support to someone who told their trauma here, or if you carry your own memory and want it to be received without spectacle, that group is where we sit together. Please be gentle. The cathedral is still there. Plaques do not always mention the nights when the bells were accompanied by something that breathed too close. Children still dare each other at the regia. Some apartments still have lights that never go out. For those who live in those places, the ordinary and the uncanny share walls and sometimes sleep in the same bed. The difference between a story and a scar is not whether pain existed, but how the community responded to it. When you walk past a church at night when the door is closed and the lamps are down, listen for a pattern. The tolling of the bell, the quiet of a neighborhood breathing, the wind weaving itself through leaves. If you hear anything that sounds wrong, a voice that imitates a prayer, a laughter that sits too long on a syllable, a light that refuses to die, do what people in these stories did at their best. Take care of each other. Bring company. Bring candles if that helps. Bring someone who will witness not only to fear but to the people behind it. Share this episode if you think someone needs to hear it. If you have a story, send it anonymously to the group. We read them, and we hold them without turning them into spectacle. Tell us what you remember and we will remember with you. And if tonight leaves you with one small stubborn sensation, a cold patch in a place you thought warm, the feeling of being watched for a second after you've turned away, know that you are not alone in that memory. Whatever you name it, whatever word you place over the shape of it, keep the care you would keep for any human wound. Soft, unhurried, and generous. The last breath of the cathedral is not for monsters. It is for people who go there to be known.